Before discussing ship statutory certification and differences in international maritime conventions, we must understand the broader international framework.
Part 1. Introduction to the United Nations and Maritime Regulation. Ship certification does not exist as an isolated requirement. Instead, it forms part of a structured global regulatory system developed through cooperation among countries under the leadership of the United Nations. The United Nations, also known as the UN, was established in 1945 after the end of the Second World War. Its main purpose was to maintain international peace and security. Over time, its role expanded to include other important areas such as economic development, environmental protection, human rights, and global governance. Today, the United Nations has 193 member states, representing almost all sovereign countries in the world. It serves as the main platform for countries to cooperate and address global challenges, including issues related to maritime safety, marine environmental protection, and sustainable shipping. Within the United Nations system, maritime governance is mainly coordinated through a specialized agency known as the International Maritime Organization, or IMO. The IMO is responsible for developing international maritime conventions, regulations, and technical standards to ensure that shipping operations are safe, secure, and environmentally responsible. These IMO conventions form the legal foundation for statutory ship certificates issued by flag states, including Malaysia. In other words, the certificates carried on board ships are closely connected to the international conventions adopted through the IMO framework. In addition, the United Nations promotes sustainable ocean governance through the Sustainable Development Goals, especially Goal 14, Life Below Water. This goal focuses on the protection of marine ecosystems, the prevention of pollution from ships, and the sustainable use of ocean resources. These global commitments directly influence the maritime regulations and certification requirements adopted by member states. Since international shipping is global in nature, ships often operate across many different jurisdictions. Therefore, consistent compliance with international conventions developed under the United Nations framework is important to ensure uniform standards in ship safety, environmental protection, and crew welfare. However, not all countries ratify the same number of conventions. Differences in convention ratification between Malaysia and other countries may lead to variations in the statutory certification requirements that ships need to carry on board. Therefore, understanding the role of the United Nations and its specialized maritime agency, the IMO, provides an important foundation for analyzing how international maritime conventions are adopted and implemented differently by different countries. Malaysia has shown a strong commitment to international maritime governance by ratifying 31 out of the 69 major international maritime conventions currently in force worldwide. This includes 30 conventions adopted under the International Maritime Organization and one key convention adopted under the International Labour Organization. Malaysia's ratification of these 31 international instruments reflects its alignment with internationally accepted requirements for statutory ship certification, environmental compliance, navigation safety, and crew welfare protection. This places Malaysia among the active flag states that support harmonized global shipping standards. Part 2. Legal bodies and law-making structure in Malaysia. Following the discussion on the International Maritime Framework, it is also necessary to understand the legal bodies and law-making structure in Malaysia. This is because international maritime conventions do not automatically operate as domestic law. They must first be adopted, implemented, and enforced through Malaysia's own legal system. Malaysia's legislation operates within a hierarchical legal system, where laws are generally divided into federal laws, state laws, and subsidiary legislation. Subsidiary legislation includes regulations, rules, orders, notifications, directions, and bylaws. At the federal level, laws are known as Acts of Parliament. These laws are passed through a formal legislative process involving the Dewan Rakyat, followed by the Dewan Negara, and finally receiving royal assent from the Yang di-Pertuan Agong. Once approved, the law must be published in the Federal Gazette before it comes into operation. These federal acts provide the legal foundation for the creation of subsidiary legislation. In the maritime context, important laws such as the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952, the Port Authorities Act 1963, and other related shipping legislation fall under this category of federal law. They provide the main legal authority for regulating shipping activities, port operations, maritime safety, and related administrative matters in Malaysia. At the state level, laws are made by the State Legislative Assembly, also known as the Dewan Undangan Negeri. In peninsular Malaysia, these laws are called enactments. In Sabah and Sarawak, state laws are known as ordinances rather than enactments. Although the terminology differs, the function is generally similar, as both refer to laws made at the state level. After being passed by the State Legislative Assembly, state laws must receive assent from the Sultan, ruler, or Yang di Pertua Negeri, depending on the state. Once approved, they are published in the State Gazette before they come into force within that particular state. The authority for both federal acts and state laws comes from the Federal Constitution of Malaysia. More specifically, the Ninth Schedule divides legislative powers into three main categories: the federal list, the state list, and the concurrent list. This division determines whether Parliament, the State Legislative Assembly, or both have the authority to make laws on a particular subject. Matters relating to shipping, navigation, maritime safety, ports, and shipping administration fall under the federal list. This means that Parliament has the authority to legislate on maritime matters. As a result, the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952 is treated as a federal law rather than a state enactment. This is because maritime activities usually involve national and international operations, so they require uniform regulation at the federal level. After Parliament passes an act, the act usually provides the main legal framework. However, it is not practical for the act to include every technical, administrative, and operational detail. Therefore, the act may delegate rule-making powers to ministers, government departments, statutory commissions, and regulatory agencies. Through these powers, the relevant authorities may create subsidiary legislation to support the operation of the main act. Subsidiary legislation provides detailed rules on matters such as licensing, enforcement, safety requirements, administrative procedures, and operational controls. This allows the law to function more effectively, as detailed rules can be updated without amending the whole act. However, subsidiary legislation cannot stand alone. It must be authorized by a parent statute, also called an enabling act, and must stay within the powers granted by that act. It must also usually be published in the Federal Gazette or State Gazette. If it exceeds the authority given by the parent act, it may be declared ultra vires, meaning invalid in law. One specific type of subsidiary legislation is bylaws. Bylaws are usually made by local authorities, municipal councils, port authorities, or statutory bodies to regulate matters within their own jurisdiction. Unlike some federal regulations, bylaws usually apply only within a specific geographical or administrative area. In the maritime context, bylaws are especially important for port administration. For example, port authorities under the Port Authorities Act 1963 or the Penang Port Commission Act 1955 may issue bylaws on vessel movement, pilotage, harbor safety, port services, and activities within port limits. This legal structure is relevant to the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952, or MSO 1952. The MSO 1952 is one of Malaysia's main federal laws governing shipping administration, vessel registration, seafarer certification, safety standards, and navigation control. Under the MSO 1952, the Minister of Transport and the Malaysia Marine Department may issue subsidiary legislation for operational maritime matters. These regulations form the practical framework for implementing Malaysia's shipping laws and supporting compliance with national legal requirements and international maritime conventions. With this foundation, the discussion can move to how subsidiary legislation is created and applied under the MSO 1952. Part 3. Maritime Parent Legislation in Malaysia and the Role of MSO 1952. Maritime regulation is supported by a network of parent legislation enacted by Parliament under the Federal List of the Federal Constitution. These parent laws provide the legal foundation for regulatory control across several maritime areas. They cover vessel operations, port governance, maritime safety, registration systems, and offshore activities. Among the most important federal maritime statutes is the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952, or MSO 1952. It remains the principal legislation governing merchant shipping in peninsular Malaysia and Labuan. In Sabah and Sarawak, separate merchant shipping ordinances 1960 apply, reflecting the historical legislative arrangements that existed before the formation of Malaysia. Together, these laws regulate important areas such as ship registration, certification of seafarers, vessel safety standards, passenger ship requirements, marine pollution control, pilotage services, wreck and salvage operations, lighthouse administration, and the powers of port officers. In addition to the Merchant Shipping Ordinance framework, several other acts support Malaysia's maritime regulatory system. These include the Federal Light Dues Act 1953, which governs the collection of navigational light dues for marine safety infrastructure, and the Port Authorities Act 1963, which establishes statutory port authorities and empowers them to regulate port operations within their jurisdictions. Other important laws include the Penang Port Commission Act 1955 and the Bintulu Port Authority Act 1981, which provide specific legislative authority for individual port commissions to administer harbor activities and issue port bylaws. The Ports Privatization Act 1990 also supports the restructuring and management of port services through corporatization and concession arrangements. Malaysia's maritime legal structure also includes specialized legislation. For example, the Petroleum Safety Measures Act 1984 regulates offshore petroleum safety zones and the protection of installations. Meanwhile, the Langkawi International Yacht Registry Act 2003 establishes a dedicated registry system for pleasure and recreational vessels operating under the Malaysian flag. Under the Langkawi International Yacht Registry Act 2003, yachts carrying more than 12 passengers must comply with passenger certification requirements under the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952. This shows that the MSO 1952 continues to function as a central reference statute within Malaysia's maritime legal hierarchy. Although these acts regulate different aspects of maritime governance, they operate together within a unified framework. This framework is administered mainly by the Ministry of Transport and implemented operationally by the Marine Department Malaysia. The Marine Department acts as the technical authority responsible for shipping administration, vessel certification, maritime safety enforcement, and regulatory compliance. Within this broader legislative structure, the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952 occupies a central position. This is because it gives the Minister of Transport the authority to make subsidiary legislation in the form of rules, regulations, and orders necessary for implementing shipping control measures. The ordinance itself was enacted to consolidate and amend the law relating to merchant shipping. It also allows the minister to bring provisions into force through Gazette notification and to prescribe technical requirements through subsidiary legislation. This delegated authority is highly significant because modern maritime regulation depends heavily on subsidiary legislation issued under the MSO 1952. These include rules relating to collision regulations, ship construction standards, load line requirements, tonnage measurement, certification of competency, survey procedures, and pilotage control. These regulations are issued through the Marine Department Malaysia, acting under powers delegated by the Minister of Transport. This helps ensure that Malaysia's shipping framework remains aligned with international maritime conventions and developing safety standards. For this reason, although Malaysia has many maritime parent statutes, the Merchant Shipping Ordinance 1952 remains the backbone of national shipping regulation. Most operational maritime requirements affecting ships, seafarers, and navigation ultimately derive their authority from this ordinance.